Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in these series of talks promoted by the United States Spiritist Federation. We meet every Saturday morning at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. And today I'm very happy to be here and host this talk by Paulo Bispo. Paulo will be talking to us about the influence of the spirit cell in cell physiology. But before I turn on to Paulo, I would like to take a moment to do an opening prayer. And with that, I would like for all of us to perhaps close our eyes. Let's just be in the moment, breathe deeply, and take this opportunity to open our hearts, our minds, and connect with all that is good. Connect with our spiritist benefactors, God, Jesus. Let us connect with all the spirits of light who are here today, who guide us through our lives on earth. And we ask that all of us be blessed. We also ask for Paulo to be the recipient of this divine inspiration during his talk, and that all of us may be touched by these words in our lives. So be it. With that, I would like to welcome Paulo. Paulo, hope you are doing well. It
Thank
is
you.
it is quite great to have you here to talk about this topic, right? Basically, the title of the topic is Influence of
Hmm.
Spirit Cell in Cell Physiology. I keep saying this wrong. The influence of the spirit in cell
Uh-huh.
physiology. And I just keep thinking that as most of the world was interrupted since March of last year due to the pandemic, this topic really reminds us of the perhaps the interconnectedness between our material and spiritual bodies. I
That's
do
right. Yeah.
appreciate, yeah, and I do appreciate enlightening us on this important and timely subject. But before you begin with this important message, I would like to formally introduce Paulo. Paulo Bispo is an active contributing member of the Allan Kardec Spiritist Society of Massachusetts. He's also a member of the U.S. Spiritist Medical Association. He is a microbiologist and infectious disease research scientist. His education is from the Federal University of São Paulo in Brazil, as well as the University of Miami School of Medicine and Harvard Medical School. Currently, professionally, Paulo is an academic scientist in Boston. Paulo, I want to welcome you once again and take this opportunity to remind everyone in the audience, please, as you listen to Paulo, send your questions. We will allow time once Paulo concludes his presentation to answer your question. Paulo, please begin.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Marcia, for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. Good morning, Marcia. And thanks again for having me here today. I'm really excited to share this topic with you all. And also, thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that here. So, I'm going to talk about this topic on the influence of the spirit and mind in the function of our cells, in the physiology of our cells. And I hope you all enjoy the information we're going to share with you today. I also hope you engage in the discussion later during the Q&A session. So let me share my slides here. I have a couple of slides I want to show. Uh, if I find it. So let's do that again. Let me try again. Here we go. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides? All good?
Yes,
All
thank
right.
you.
So let's start. So what I'm gonna do in the next 40 minutes or so is to present and discuss some selected hypotheses on the control of our body functions that were extracted from Spiritist books, especially from Evolution in Two Words, that was dictated by the spirit of André Luiz and written by Francisco Cândido Xavier. And I want to combine this information with a very quick overview on the evidences we have collected in the past decades by scientific experimentation on the impact of our mind, thoughts, emotional states on the physiology of these small units of lives that we call cells, and how that results in downstream systemic consequences that are going to determine our physical health. So the World Health Organization uh, recognized the existence of more than one dimension that determines our health. So uh, the definition of health by the World Health Organization says that it's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And this is nice because, as I said, it recognizes the existence of more than one dimension to our lives. We're not just biological entities, we're spiritual entities, we're social animals as well. And all of these dimensions, they determine our health. And to put this definition do not put an emphasis only on the biological dimension when it says not merely the absence of disease, or better, of a disease that can be easily detected by the diagnostic tools of modern medicine, but it stresses that we, as social and complex individuals, have to take care of all the important aspects of our existence to achieve health. And this is a model that integrates three different dimensions, as I mentioned: the biological dimension, the psychological or the mental, and also the social. Uh, and this is a model that is being explored in medicine for a couple of decades now in a field that we call psychosomatic medicine. So biomedical research in medicine in general, and researchers are exploring this impact of our social life, or of our mental states in our health. And this, as I said, is called psychosomatic medicine, which integrates three different dimensions: the biological, the psychological, and the social dimensions of medicine, to create a more whole or complete understanding of the pathogenesis of many different diseases by trying to identify these biological intersection points where all these three dimensions converge to meet each other in the biological entity in our bodies. And so by doing so, it becomes very clear that there are three main biological intersection points where the psyche, where the social factors meet biology, and 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 these include the brain, the endocrine system, and also the immune system. So this model that was created to study these interactions is then called the psychoneuroendocrinal-immunology model. That's a very long word. We can just call that the PNEI. So the PNEI model studies, as I said, the mechanism by which the psyche, the mind, our thoughts, and the soma, or our body, our physical body, our biological body, are linked by understanding the interactions between the mind and the brain and the endocrine functions, and also the immunological responses that happen in the face of multiple psychosocial stresses that can break the balance between these interconnected systems. They're all interconnected. When one system is not working well, when there's a problem with one of them, the other one also feel those consequences, right? And when that happens, when we have a disbalance in one of those systems that are very interconnected, that leads to different disease. And that's interesting to find that this idea that the mind is directly linked to our bodies and can determine our health status, depending on the nature of the information we're feeding our brains. If the information is positive, the consequences are also positive. If the information is negative, the consequences are going to be negative as well. So that was also described many decades ago, even before we started to apply this PNEI model in biomedical research. And that was described actually by the spirit of André Luiz in the book Evolution in Two Words. So in one of the chapters of this book that was published for the first time in 1958, André Luiz talks about the evolution of our metabolism and body functions from a spiritual standpoint. And he says that laboring patiently for centuries to reach the primitive civilization of the Paleolithic era, the human mind almost fully controls the body. The human mind controls most of the functions of our body in which it expresses itself. So and there are 2 points here that I think is interesting. The first thing that he says that the mind uses the body to express itself. And thus it's not a secretion of the body, or more specifically, a secretion of the brain, as we sometimes understand in some fields of medicine and science, but it's the mind that controls almost all the functions of the body. So the mind is expressed through the brains. It's not a secretion of the brain. It uses the brain as a tool for its expression. And in fact, it used the whole body, actually, as we're going to understand that later, to express all our different mental states. And here, then he says that it proceeds to manage the process of the metabolism and its organization and adaptation through the coordination of its own impulses over the albuminoid elements of the cytoplasm. And here's is a point to the existence of a link between the mind with the specific parts of the physical body. In this case, a part of all of the cells that make up of our body that is called the cytoplasm. So the consequence of this connection between the mind and the body is something that we're now aware of because of the psychosomatic medicine research, using the PNEI model that has been elucidating through experimentation the positive and the negative effects of the mind-body connection, of the mind-body interactions. And I will show you a couple of examples, particularly on the impact of psychosocial experiences and the risk of developing infectious disease. So the first studies on this area were carried out in animal model, and this particular model that I'm showing here, the researchers infected rhesus monkeys with this virus here that is called the simian immunodeficiency virus, or CIV, which is a very similar virus to HIV that causes AIDS in humans. These viruses cause a similar disease in monkeys as well. So what they did was to infect these monkeys and then separate them in 2 different groups. One group was put in a stable social condition throughout the whole experiment. The whole experiment was carried out for 10 weeks. So the first group was put in this stable community, this stable environment where animals in the cage were not changed. So they had the opportunity to create bonds between each other and remain part of the same small social community for the whole experiment. The other group had animals that were constantly switched from the cages, did not have time to form those bonds, and had to adapt to a new group frequently during the experiment. So what happened here is that the individuals in the stable social conditions, of course, were less aggressive and had less conflictual interactions. There was sort of the result of this more healthy and more stable social environment. The animals in the stable social environment, they had this tendency to be more aggressive. There was more fights. There were more conflictual interactions between them to be accepted in that community. So that, of course, creates psychosocial stress for those animals. And again, both of those groups were infected with SIV. So then the researchers looked at the viral load between those 2 groups of animals, and what they found is that the animals in the stable social conditions had less viral particles circulating in their bodies at the end of the experiment. They had more antibodies at week 8 against this particular virus. IgG is one of the forms of antibodies that we form against different pathogens, and these animals in the stable groups had more of these antibodies that fight the infections, and they survived longer as well. So later research on humans showed similar results as well. So this group here studied 54 HIV positive men with a steady viral load. So that means that the viral load was not changing a lot over time. So they select this group because they wanted to see the impact of this same similar social inhibition or social environment in the viral load of human beings infected with HIV. So then they separated these group in two different groups according to their social interactions, and then they termed their social inhibition score by a composite score that used a bunch of different questionnaires and a bunch of different tools that are very common in psychology. So then they studied different things. They studied the autonomic nervous system activity in these two groups, the HIV load, the amount of these cells here that are very important immune cells. Those are lymphocytes that fight infections. And these are exactly the cells that HIV can infect and kill. Okay, so the more you have, the more CD4 T cells you have, better is the immune system. And they also look for the virological responses to treatment. And what they found was that the socially inhibited individuals had a higher autonomic nervous system activity. So their brain or their nervous system was, let's say, a little bit more stressed. It was more active. And that is part of the autonomic nervous system is divided in two. And one that is very important here is the sympathetic nervous system, because the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the generation of two molecules, noradrenaline and also adrenaline, that are molecules that we produce when we are stressed in stress conditions. And these molecules here, we know that they have receptors in immune cells. And what happens when they bind to the immune cells, they decrease the expression of two very important natural antiviral molecules that we call interferon A and B, or alpha and beta. So these, again, these individuals here that are socially inhibited, they had a higher activity of this particular part of their nervous system, and thus they could potentially have a lower expression of these natural antiviral molecules that are produced by our immune system. If that happened, then we'd probably see an effect here as well in the HIV load, in the levels of CD4 cells, and also the virological response to treatment, and that happened. So this group here that was considered the socially inhibited group, they had viral loads that were higher than the other group, 8 times higher than the other group, and a poor response to the treatment as well. So they had less viral reduction after treatment, and no significant increase in the CD4 counts. So, and then of course, when we look at this, we can ask the question, okay, if negative mental states can impact the pathogenesis of HIV infection in human beings, if we try to take this stressor out, if we try to cope with that stress, with the stress of having HIV, of other psychosocial stresses that are common in the environment, what happens with the disease progression? So that study here looked at the 3 different groups that used spirituality for coping with the fact that they had HIV. So they included 177 HIV positive patients, and then they looked for psychobiological factors, as I said, spiritual coping, and also the viral load and the levels of these immune cells. They followed this group for 10 years, and they saw each of these patients every 6 months. So after 10 years, this is what they found about the coping mechanisms in this group. 65% of them used spirituality for positive coping, 7% of them for negative coping, and 28% of them did not use spirituality for coping. And that's what they found here. So they created a statistical model to calculate the longitudinal effect of the positive and negative spiritual coping on HIV load and CD4 counts. So by using these, they can create this number here called T ratio that is usually important, relevant when it's over 1.9. And also they calculate the p-values, which is a calculation that we use to determine if the differences between two groups are statistically significant or not. And it should be smaller than 0.05 when it is significant. And as you can see here, it was for all of them. So as a conclusion here, you can say that positive spiritual coping is associated with a better response, or a better response of our immune cells, right? Of our immune system to control the number of viral particles in our body. So patients here that use the spirituality for positive coping had a lower amount of viral particles circulating in their bodies and a higher count of the immune cells that are important for the response to this infection. And this list goes on. So I just wanted to show a couple of examples on infectious disease, but we know that psychosocial stresses, they can influence our health and can impact the pathogens of many other diseases, including autoimmune disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, which is a collection of different metabolic dysfunctions that we have in our body, like hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, that could lead to cardiovascular disease. Mental illnesses as well, like depression, aging, and lifespan. Okay, so now we can, now that we determine that mental states can increase or decrease our risk to develop disease, we can ask the question, what are the targets of negative and positive mental states in our bodies? And these are, of course, the fundamental units of life we call cells. Our body is a collection of around 10 trillion cells. So there is a lot of these very small units of lives that make up our bodies, that together form the tissues, the organs, and the systems, and are, of course, the targets of positive and negative mental states that are going to create downstream systemic effects that can determine our health status, that can determine health or disease in specific tissues or organs. So if cells are the targets of our spiritual mental state, how are they connected to each other? How are the spirit and mind connect to the body and connect to the cell? So let's go back to Genesis, where Allan Kardec writes about the process of reincarnation and describes how the spirit connects to the body at the moment that the egg is fertilized. So here Allan Kardec says, the spirit, due to its spiritual essence, is an unlimited abstract being which can have no direct action upon matter. An intermediary is necessary to it. This envelope, designated perispirit, from an abstract being, makes of the spirit a concrete, defined being, seized by the thought. So here he says that the intermediary, the perispirit that is between our body and between our spirit, is a reflection of our mental states, of our mental landscapes, or our mental screens. So the perispiritual fluid is then the bond between the spirit and matter under the influence of the vital material principle of the germ or the egg. The perispirit, which possesses certain properties of matter, is united molecule by molecule with the forming body. Hence, one can say that the spirit, through the perispirit, takes root in the germ like a plant in the earth. So the perispirit, or the spiritual body, André Luiz called the perispirit the spiritual body, it's the same thing, is that force that connects the spirit to ourselves and to our bodies, and serves as a mode to organize our biology, to organize our physical bodies. So André Luiz in Evolution in Two Words says that from unicellular organisms to complex organisms, the mind presides over the cells. It used the threads of experience to weave the tunic of its own exteriorization in accordance with the mental mode it brings with itself. I think that's so beautiful because it reminds us that the spiritual body, as a fluidic entity, can change over time according to our spiritual progress and our mental mode, our mental states. Then the information that is going to be feeding ourselves is the result of the choices we made in the past that we carry in our perispirit, in our spiritual body, that makes us more or less evolved, and that is reflected in the spiritual body. And the choices we make daily as well by selecting different narratives, right? That could be either positive or negative in our mental landscapes. So our choices, either the present choices or the past choices, are going to shape the structure of this spiritual body. And this spiritual body, of course, is going to um, uh, uh, everything that we carry there, all the information is going to impact ourselves and our bodies. Okay, so now that we have established that our spirit and mind are connected to ourselves through the spiritual body, this intermediate entity that connects the spirit and body and cells, we can start to go a little bit further and understand this connection deeper, and ask the question where exactly in the cell the spirit is anchored, right? Where the spirit and cells unite. Is that in the nucleus of the cell where the DNA is located? Is it located in other parts of the cell? So here, André Luiz, also in Evolution in Two Words, says that the intelligence influencing the cytoplasm, which ultimately in the interstitial element of connection for the physio-psychosomatic forces. So here he combines the soma, the psyche, with the function of our cells and call that one unit of force, right? So the connection between all these three units of forces happen in the cytoplasm. So let's go back here. The interstitial element of connection for the physio-psychosomatic forces obliges the cells to do the work they need to express themselves. And then he says in another part of the same chapter, they, incarnated spirits, can, by their own right or wrong behavior, increase or diminish the hues of the plants that indicate their path through the units of psychosomatic forces that act within the cytoplasm, projecting on the cells and consequently on the body the mental states that will better or worsen their situation according to their choices. So it reinforces again that what happens in our cells functionally in the cytoplasm, that is sort of the stage, right, where all the cell metabolism and functions happen, is pretty much a consequence of our thoughts. So the spirit or the mind, the intelligence, is connected directly to our cells through the cytoplasm. And for me, this is really interesting to think about the idea that what happens inside of our cells is determined by the environment surrounding them, by external forces that converge in the cytoplasm. So the flux of information that controls the cells is from outside to inside and not from inside to outside, like we taught for a long time in science. So, for a long time, especially after the discovery of the DNA structure by Francis Crick and James Watson, and the publication of the Central Dogma of Biology, which focused on the nucleus of the cell, specifically in the DNA and genes as entities that control life because they make all the proteins that are part of our cells and our bodies, right? So somehow those genes determine the character of our lives. So we created this belief that genes control life. This created, of course, some sort of a gene mania in science. That a lot of my colleagues working on cell biology and molecular biology as well, were highly interested in understanding everything that happens in our body, diseases, our behaviors, talents, intelligence, by studying only the genes. Like that, all the information to make life and all the control of life was dictated by these small DNA entities that we call genes. Um, so that motivated us to start the Human Genome Project with the goal of mapping all the genes of human genome from both a physical, that means the location of the genes and the chromosome, and also a functional standpoint. And we wanted to understand what genes X, Y, Z are responsible for. What are the diseases that are responsible for, or the characters, or specific features of each individual, right? So before starting that project, we estimated that we had more than 100,000 genes, right? So that was the estimated number of genes that could explain the complexity of the human beings, of our species. But as we actually started to generate data, we found that the actual number was actually a bit over 20,000 genes. That's not much more than the number of genes that we can find in a Drosophila, which is also called the fruit fly, right? Those that grow in our bananas sometimes in our home. So we don't have much more genes than those fruit flies. And we have less genes than a corn, almost 12,000 genes less than a corn cob. And if we look at the collection of genes that are present in our body, but not in our cells, in a collection of cells that we call the human microbiome, which is the collection of all the bacteria, all the viruses, all the good microbes that live in and on us, the number of genes that we have in our cells is less than 1/10 of the number of the whole collection of genes from microbes that are living in our bodies. So it became very clear that the complexity of our species and our bodies is not dictated by our genes only. The genes are just a blueprint, or let's say a recipe to make the proteins we need. Of course, those proteins are important. Of course, those proteins make life, right? Because those are structured proteins that make our cells, or functional proteins like enzymes that are important for the metabolism, or proteins that make hormones, for example, that are also important for the metabolism and for the control of our whole body, But the genes or the DNA is just a recipe to make those proteins. What you're going to turn on and off comes from the environment. And according to that information that is being fed from that environment, if the information is positive or negative, we're going to have different consequences, right? So that became very clear, that the environment is important to control which genes are going to be on and off when we started to work with stem cells. So stem cells are cells that are capable of making all the specialized and differentiated cells in our bodies, like neurons, liver cells, muscle cells, bones, and etc. So they're very different from one another, right? Neurons and liver cells and bone cells, but they all come from the same um, um, uh, germline cells that we call stem cells, right? So stem cells are like a blank check, right, for the creation of these different cells in our bodies. And because of that, these cells became of high interest in biomedical research to treat a lot of different disease by replacing the sick cells with a healthy one made in the lab. So we can do that in the lab by extracting stem cells from embryos, for example, and we can expand those embryonic cells coming from just one embryo. So they're genetically identical, right? We can expand them and grow them in the lab. But then how, oops, um, can you just confirm that you can still see my slides?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Um, so these cells, as I said, are genetically identical. So how can we differentiate them? So the genes cannot do that by themselves. They cannot just determine from inside out what's going to happen with the fate of those cells, if they're going to become a muscle cell or a liver cell. What changes here is the environment. So if you want to take a stem cell and create neurons from that, you need to know what is the information that they need to turn genes on and off to create a neuron. And that is dictated by the environment and not by the genes. Again, the genes are just blueprints. So if we can turn genes on and off during stem cell differentiation to result in an array of distinct specialized cell populations, that happens through something that we now call epigenetics. So epigenetics is everything that is, let's say, above genetics, is the study of how your behaviors and the environment can cause change that affect the way your genes work. So unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible. So genetic changes like mutations, deletions, they're not reversible, but the epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change the DNA sequence. The DNA sequence keeps the same, is still the same. What changes is the environment in the cell. What changes the cytoplasm and how the proteins are working in the cytoplasm and affecting our DNA and controlling the expression of genes in our DNA. So they can change how your body reads the DNA sequence, but it does not change the sequence itself. So by turning genes on and off, we can, for example, with stem cells, make in the laboratory, we can make liver cells if you know the switches, right? If you know which switch you have to turn on, which one has to be off, you can differentiate those cells and make specialized cells in the lab. Okay, so that's interesting because it shows a very important control of the environment in our gene expression and also in the differentiation of cells. So if we can turn those genes on and off during stem cell differentiation to result in different cell populations, how about turning genes on and off that are associated with specific behaviors or with specific disease, for example? We can also do that through epigenetics. And here is an example that I want to show you. In this research here, um, they selected monozygotic twins. So those are twins that came from the same egg, right? So they have exactly the same genetic content, the same genes, right? But in this case, one of the twins developed a congenital heart disease and the other one had a completely healthy heart. So how can you explain that? If the genes are the same, with the genetic material is basically the same, how can you explain that? So they try to understand that by sequencing the genomes of these two individuals to look for specific mutations that could have happened after they were born, deletions in genes or sequences of genes, insertions and things like that, rearrangements that happen during cell replication. So they sequenced those genomes and they found that there is a variation, especially of small mutations that we call SNPs or single mutations, single point mutations. But none of them, first, a very small number, 0.46% of difference between those two individuals. And none of them were related to heart disease, or none of those mutations were in genes that are associated with heart development as well. So then what they did was to look for markers of epigenetic modifications in their genomes. And what they found with this specific epigenetic modification that we call methylation. So methylation is one of the ways that we can turn genes on and off. What they found is that the person, the individual with a heart problem, had much more epigenetic modifications in its genome than the other one that had a healthy heart. And those epigenetic modifications were mainly associated with genes that control heart development and are associated with heart disease. So these individuals are basically the same in terms of their genetic content, right? There's no um, uh, great amount of variation in their genomes. They came from the same fertilized egg. So what is the only difference between them that could determine one having these epigenetic modifications that lead to congenital heart disease, while the other one has a perfect and healthy heart? So this is the only difference, right? The only difference here, and it's a massive one, although they have the same genetic makeup, although they probably look alike and probably have a lot of things in common, they're completely different and individualized intelligence. They two, they're two completely different spirits that because of that have different spiritual bodies as well. And those spiritual bodies are imprinting different informations in their cells, right? So the information that we're feeding our bodies through the spirit and the spiritual body is going to imprint modifications in our cells. It's going to imprint modifications in the expression of genes in our cells through these epigenetic modifications. And here's a study that shows that the mind can impact the epigenetic process in our cells. So here, there's a lot of different examples, and I selected this one here. That is a study that looked for the impact of depression and anxiety, maternal depression and anxiety, in the brain development, in the brain development of the infant, right, of the baby. So they found that mothers with depression and anxiety, their babies are born with specific modifications in the prefrontal cortex, and they did that with 1 month old infants. So the density of these areas were impacted. They had less neurons in their prefrontal cortex. So they wanted to understand the mechanism of these impact in brain development in infants of mothers that had depression and anxiety. So they included 42 different patients, and what they did was to extract the blood from the umbilical cord, and then they extracted DNA, and they looked for specific, not differences in gene content, but they looked for specific epigenetic modifications through different mechanisms in the blood in the umbilical cord. And what they found was that there were around 218 modifications in the DNA of these umbilical cords that were associated with structural modifications in the white matter of these babies that have, a smaller density of their frontal cortex. So it shows that, the mental states of the mother, either depression, anxiety, negative mental states, emotional states, can impact the methylation or the epigenetic of the cells of the infants as well, of the babies. And that it translates in this case into impacts in brain development. So just to start to finish, I think I was able to show so far that our mental states, our spiritual states can really impact the function of our cells through different mechanisms. And I want to finish by talking about something that for me is really interesting in the book Evolution in Two Words, which is a definition of cells. So André Luiz says that cells are infinitesimal animalculous domesticated and organized in the organic hive, take on different forms according to the situation of the individual and the nature of the tissues in which they're grouped. So domesticated and organized, for me, that is really interesting because first, when you look at the organization, like in an organic hive, it really happens. So this is a picture of a human cornea. This is a diagram, a representation of the human cornea, and this is a true histology section of the human cornea. And look at the organization of those cells, right? So there are different cells, all that came from stem cells, right? That differentiated to become specialized cells and become very, very, very organized. How they know? How they know how to do that? How they can become so organized and so specialized and know what they have or not to do? So Andrea Luis says that there is a master, right? Domesticating those cells, domesticating the function of those cells, domesticating the structure of those cells as well, and organizing them into tissues, organs, and systems. And all of these cells are obeying the simple or complex thought that controls their existence. So we are domesticating ourselves with our minds, with our spirits. In another part of this book, he says they appear in multiple forms, adapting to their particular functions in the vehicle of manifestation of the creature that temporarily harbors them, much like intelligent electromagnetic parts in a superintelligent electromagnetic machine, attending to the commands of the mind with mathematical precision. In the organism, this is somewhat similar to the millions of atoms that harmoniously comprise piano strings. I like uh, uh, that example that he used. And then he says that in that they're made to vibrate by the microscopic hammers of the nerves when struck by the keys that may be symbolized as the energetic fulcrums of the encephalic cortex, moved and controlled by the spirit by the means of the crown center, which sustain the conjunction of the mental life with the physical body in which it expresses itself. So it's like every time that we are creating thoughts, all the mental processes, it's like we're creating harmony or not, right? The melodies that our cells, that our bodies are going to hear from our thoughts really depends on the keys that we're pressing all the time. If we're pressing the right keys, if we know what you're doing in the keys, right, we can create nice melodies and the cells are going to understand that. If we don't know, if we don't create a good harmony, a good melody, well, the cells are going to be impacted by that as well. And I want to finish by just summarizing this talk with an extraction or a couple of extractions from a book that was published by Divaldo Franco and that was dictated by the spirit Joana de Angelis. I'm not really sure if this book is translated into English. The name is The Love as the Solution. I was not able to find an English version, but I did a free translation of some extractions that I think summarize very well what we just discussed. So Joana de Angelis says the cause of every serious disorder and dysfunction that takes place in the cellular organization of the human being or in the delicate tissues of his psyche is fixed in the spirit. Illness, therefore, is the result of the inharmony of vibrations emitted by the thinking being. These constant waves, which are generated by the mind, interfere in the psychological instrument, generating psychological, psychiatric, and organic disorders. The entire structure of body cells vibrates in the semi-material mode of the perispirit or the spiritual body, which is a model of biological organization. In addition to medical treatments, every patient needs spiritual stimuli in order to wake up from the lethargy he allows himself, having to modify the mental landscapes, adding edifying thoughts, interest in self knowledge in order to neutralize the successive waves of pessimism and revolt. So, with that, I want to finish here this presentation, and I'll be very happy to take questions and discuss the questions that came in through the chat.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Paulo. Wow, complex, difficult, but indeed very enlightening discussion. And I love the fact that you're bringing to us, to the audience, that perhaps has read some of the books that you brought to us, Allan Kardec Genesis or Evolution into Worlds, or even this one. By Joanna De Angelis, some very
Mhm.
good explanation on how to interpret those thoughts or how to
Yeah.
connect those thoughts. So thank you. We are now open for your comments and questions, and we have one. So, Daniel, hi, Daniel, says, hi, Paulo. What do you think about the idea that the physical body also can
Yeah.
affect the spirit in a reverse mechanism?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because we come here to Earth to evolve and progress, right? And we are connected to our spirit and to our spiritual body. So I do think that, Emmanuel talks about that actually in a book called O Consolador. I don't know the translation for that. I don't know if there is a translation for that. Um, but, there is sometimes a specific physical issues, physical problems that we come to Earth with this sort of it's part of our program, right? We want to come here to get rid of some spiritual problems, and sometimes those spiritual problems express as disease. And some of this disease we cannot choose if we're going to have them or not, right? And that is one of the ways that we can actually fix or correct our spiritual body. So I think, Daniel, there is a reverse mechanism as well, because some of these diseases that we express here in our physical bodies could be actually the mechanism that we're healing our spirits. So there is, I think, a reverse mechanism. Because one of the things, just to end this, um, in some books there are mentions that for each cells in our bodies we have a cell as well in our perispirit, right? So just think about that. Our perispirit is like the same composition, although it's not material, it's same material, but there are cells connected to each cells. So if we have diseased cells in our bodies, those have also a correspondent in the spiritual body. And sometimes, the disease cells in our bodies is actually the way that we use to correct the cells in our spiritual body,
Fascinating. Thank you.
right?
It's a dialogue. Hi, Kirsten. Kirsten has asked, is the turning off and on of genes solely from the environment? I thought it could be both intrinsic and extrinsic factors.
Yeah. Well, when I say environment, I'm talking about the environment around the nucleus, right? So there's definitely intrinsic factors as well from the bodies that are regulating our gene expression. Um, for example, different hormones, right? Different molecules that we make under stress that can control gene expression. So those are intrinsic factors. But then I could ask Kirsten how those intrinsic factors that we produce are regulated by external factors, because they are regulated by external factors. They are regulated by the spirit. As André Luis said in the last slide that I showed, um, the spirit is connected to the body through the crown center, right? And through the pineal gland as well. So the pineal gland is very important to control the endocrine system. Okay, so basically, when you talk about endocrine system and all the hormones that we're producing, it's basically a consequence of our mental states, some of them, right? If we are in conditions of psychosocial stressors, for example, we can change some of those hormones because our spirit is directly linked to the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is really important to control the pituitary gland, which is sort of the master of the endocrine system, right? So there are definitely both factors. We do have a lot of intrinsic factors that are regulating, because we have to think about this. So uh, the spiritual dimension is energy, right? But the biological dimension is chemistry. So all of these things that we say, our thoughts, our mental states, our emotional states, are going to translate into biology. When we think about that, we have to think that this is going to be translated into chemistry, into organic chemistry, right? Into hormones and molecules that are going to later control gene expression.
This is awesome. Thank you. And I keep thinking it's physics and chemistry, right? Energy and
Yeah.
chemistry. Yeah. So, L. Katz is asking, are there any scientific studies which support the existence of a spirit body?
Yeah, probably not calling that name. but there are
Okay.
studies on the model of biological organization, which is pretty much the same thing, right? That mode that organize our bodies and our biology. There are studies on that. We just don't call that a spiritual body.
I hope that's sufficient answer, and maybe we can bring that later on. What would
Sure.
be those studies? So, hi Yasko. Yasko's asking, fascinating topic, dear Paulo. Viktor Frankl found that among those that endured better the horror of the
Hmm.
Holocaust were the ones with a higher sense of purpose in life.
Yeah.
Today, we hear that existential emptiness, more or less the opposite, is underlying the rise in numbers of depression, suicide. In your opinion, how is this chain of spiritual, psychosocial, immuno, neurochemical state of a patient spiritism can intervene to more
Yeah.
effectively reverse this tendency? Very good question,
Yeah.
isn't it?
That's a great question. Thanks, Yasko. So I think the first important thing to say is that as we are beings with multiple dimensions, with a spiritual dimension, with a social dimension, and a biological one, you need to take care of all of them. So the biological dimension needs to be treated. And the way that we treat the biological dimension is through medical treatments, through molecules, drugs, right, that we use to treat a specific disease. So that is an important thing that I just want to emphasize before we can discuss the spiritual dimension, because I don't like the idea of giving up on the other dimensions to treat just one, right? I think we need to take care of all of them at the same time to actually help more of the patients. And that's a problem that we can have in the spirituals, because or in other spiritualist doctrines or communities, that we don't sometimes take care too much of the biological dimension. And that's definitely a problem in medicine, that we take care only of the biological dimension and then don't look to the other dimension. But anyway, so I think that spiritism, can help us in making ourselves happier, healthier, by helping us to change our mental screens, our mental landscapes. So every time that we're reading, studying in groups, and we're learning more about our true existence that is spiritual, right? And we're talking about charity, we're talking about love, we're talking about why we are here. All of that, in my opinion, help us to change our thoughts, to change our mental states, and become better individuals, better spirits, better human beings. And I think, this is definitely one of the ways that we can help people treat disease and have, or not maybe not just treat disease, but have a better and a healthier life, right? Because all of these thoughts, all of these mental states, everything that we are carrying in our spirit, all the past problems, all the current problems, they're all going to be expressed in our bodies, in ourselves. So Joanna de Angelis talks about that a lot. Um, in that book that I mentioned, The Love as the Solution, it's pretty implicit, right? That she creates a narrative that the only way that we're gonna for sure treat our spirits, for sure treat all the disease in our souls, is by learning how to love. And she's, of course, talking about the Christian love, right? The agape, that unconditional love, and how to put that in practice that we call charity. And Allan Kardec says that without charity, there is no salvation. There's no way that we can fix our problems. There's no way that we can have healthy lives, right?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the explanation. And Louise, thank you, Louise, asking us, is there scientific research on how the mental state influences cell metabolism, whether it is through chemical messengers or electromagnetic action?
Yeah, there is. There is a lot of research on psychosomatic medicine. As I showed, that model that we call the psychoneural endocrino-immunology model, it works with all these different systems and tries to understand the impact on cell physiology and cell metabolism. Yeah, there is a lot of research on that.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. Tiago is saying, great presentation. What I got from it is that the spirit rules and does so through the cytoplasm, which is actually more important than DNA. Is this right, Paulo?
Yeah, yeah. So again, the DNA is just a blueprint, right?
Hmm.
We had that tendency to think that DNA is controlling our lives, but the information is actually coming from external factors. It's not coming from inside of ourselves. And the since the spirit is actually controlling that, as we saw in the evolution in two words, um, the spirit is controlling the function of our cells, the metabolism of our cells, and is directly connected to the cytoplasm, Tiago. So that's how the spirit is anchored. Now we can of course think about dig a little bit deeper, dissect a little bit more, and think about where exactly in the cytoplasm, because in the cytoplasm we have a lot of organelles embedded there. We have the nucleus, we have organelles, we have a lot of proteins, we have cytoskeleton, microtubules and things like that. So we can think, well, where exactly the mind, the thoughts, the mental states, and the spirit is actually connecting through the cytoplasm. That is something that there's a bunch of different hypotheses. Some scientists actually that work with um, science and spirituality, healthy spirituality, they raise the hypothesis that is through the microtubules and the cytoskeleton. Um, there are some people talking about the mitochondria as well. The mitochondria is a very important organelle in the body. So there are a couple of different hypotheses, and I think I think it's going to be really interesting to explore that in the future, thinking about merging these two fields, spirituality and cell biology. And there's a lot of people actually working on cell biology that are not religious people that are looking into that, especially in the function of the mitochondria in connecting our spirit to the cytoplasm and to the whole cell.
Fascinating. Fascinating. So Gregory Bennett is asking, fantastic talk, Paulo. Do you think that the perispirit may have a more direct link with the genes in the mitochondria?
The perispirit may have a more direct link. Yeah, um, I don't know, Gregory. Potentially, I think it's possible. I think that's a nice hypothesis because we think about the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cells because it produces the ATPs, which is the molecule that we use for energy, right? To make energy in our cells. Um, but it's not just a powerhouse. The mitochondria is doing a lot of other things, and also there is a talk between. So the mitochondria has its own DNA. It's really interesting, and the DNA comes only from the mother, right? And that's probably because of the evolution process and how the mitochondria were created during the evolution process. The mitochondria is actually a reminiscent gram-negative bacteria that live in the oceans and that found another cell larger than it. It was engulfed by that cell, and that's how eukaryotic cells were created. So the mitochondria is actually a very, very old bacteria that has its own DNA. Um, and so that DNA, it's very short, it's very small in length, but it controls a bunch of functions of the mitochondria, but it also controls some of those proteins, controls some of the genes that are in the nucleus actually. And there are other molecules as well that are generated through the mitochondria because of the respiration, right? The respiration creates a lot of um, oxidative elements, right? And those elements that we call ROS, reactive oxygen elements, um, they are part of the oxidative stress mechanism in our bodies, and they control gene expression as well. And all of that happens in the mitochondria. So there's probably a link between mitochondria gene expression and and the perispirit.
More to come on that. Maybe a second
Yeah,
talk
just on
or a
mitochondria.
book. Thank you. Luis is asking again. Hi, Luis. You have mentioned, and I concur, that the perispirit has a cell to cell mapping between perispirit and the physical body. What about the brain? Is there the same one to one mapping of cells?
So I understand here that when you ask about the brain, if there is like a neural system in the perispirit as well. That's how I'm understanding that. And I think from all that I read from André Luiz, Allan Kardec as well, is that we have, you know, cells in the perispirit for each unique cells in our bodies. So Allan Kardec says that the perispirit is connected to our bodies molecule by molecule, not cell by cell. It goes further right into the cell and says that it's connected molecule by molecule. So I think there's probably a correspondence in cell in brain cells in the perispirit as well.
Good point. Thanks. And Yasko's asking, Paulo, you've been active in the medical field. How far is the mainstream medicine in US considering the spiritual factor in the treatment of their patients?
Very far, Yasko, but I think we're making progress, slow progress. That's how we progress, right? It's usually slow. But there's a lot of good things happening. I think so the hospital where it works, it's actually a group of different hospitals. We have general hospitals and also a specialized hospital. One is a psychiatric hospital, and it's so nice to see that now they have a particular group there working on spirituality and psychological health. So they're not forcing the patients to include the treatment of the spiritual dimension, which I think is great because not all patients are going to like it or they need it, right? So it's there. If the patients want to, they can have a talk with a person who talks about the spirituality and includes that into the treatment of psychiatric disease. In the general hospital where I work, we also have a very nice institute there for mind-body connection. There's a lot of psychiatrists there and other physicians that are creating a bunch of different programs that are additional to the mainstream medical treatment. So if the patients want to have that, they can also have access to that. So I think we're, you know, making progress, but it's definitely not mainstream yet.
I can see that. Yeah, thank you. Paulo, this is from the Spiritist Federation. Thank you for alerting us that it is our choice to focus on either our present or past experience to how ex- experiences will express themselves in our bodies. Can you discuss how a negative experience, such as a trauma experience, traumatic experience, is expressed through disease?
So I think you know, I can, but I think it's very difficult to say negative is emotional experience X is going to become
Hmm.
physical disease Y. I think there's no simple correlation like that. We are very complex beings, right? We are very complex biological entities,
Hmm.
and we're very complex spirits as well. We all have different pasts. We all have different memories in our spirit. We all have carry all those different memories in our perispirit, right? So what happens with emotional negative emotional experience is going to depend on the spiritual propensities to develop disease. Let me try to explain this. So André Luiz, also in Evolution in Two Words, it's the last or the one of the last chapters. He talks about areas in our spiritual body that he calls um, areas of areas that predispose disease, right? So those areas that predispose disease, we carry in our spiritual body, and we of course don't know that. And this is the result of all the experiences that we had in the past, plus the current experiences, right? So all the negative emotional states are going to find those areas that predispose disease and are going to interact with that in different ways, and that's going to result in different physical disease. And I think, you know, it's going to be different for different people. So when I talk about the epigenetic modifications, for example, that happen in negative mental states, not all the mothers have that sort of epigenetic modification in the DNA that is going to be translated into problems in brain development. So some do not go to the brain, some maybe could go to another organ, right? And it really depends on how which sort of areas of predispositions we have in our spiritual body.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. Let's see if we have, I believe this is our last question due to time, but
Okay.
question is from the United States Spiritist Federation site. As we evolve morally and intellectually, and the perispirit becomes more ethereal, what can we expect will happen to the physical body?
I think the physical body is going to be more and more refined as we progress, and it's not just not a thought that has no um, um, rationale behind. So just think about the bodies when we were primitive beings, when we're primitive spirits as well. Our bodies here on Earth were completely different from the bodies that we have right now. They're much more rough, right? So as we progress morally and intellectually, our physical body is going to become more refined as well. And we're not going to have a lot of the needs that we have right now. Um, Andre Luis talks about that also in Evolution in Two Words, how the the centers, the centers of energy change as we progress spiritually and morally, intellectually and morally. And he says that at some point, some of those centers they become so thin, so weak that we don't need that anymore. And he talks about specifically about the um, um, two centers, one that is related to digestion and the stomach, and the other one with sexuality. That, as we progress morally, intellectually, these two centers are going to become weaker and weaker, and in the future we might not need that. So yesterday, just by coincidence, I was reading a book by Chico Xavier that I just forgot the name now, but Humberto de Campos describes his experience of going to Mars, to look at the population that live in Mars, right? And we know that population in Mars and Jupiter and other planets in our solar system, they're a little bit more evolved than us, right? And he talks about that. He talks that their bodies are so different because they're more evolved, and they don't need to eat the same things that we eat here because they don't have the same necessities. The cells don't need the same things that we need right now because they're more evolved spiritually.
That's great. Well, I think we have perhaps reached the end of our talk today, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you. And there are several uh, thanks from the audience. So Luis says, Paulo, again, congratulations on an excellent lecture. We're
My
grateful for
pleasure.
you. Yeah. And for sharing your profound knowledge. Thank you, Luis, for sharing that. And I just want to say, on behalf of the United Spiritist Federation, thank you. It's truly in touching and inspirational. It makes us really want to study and read again.
Mhm.
Right? Thank you,
I'm glad
everyone.
to hear that. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone who watched this live talk. I appreciate all of you who are watching this on a weekly basis, that are following those weekly talks. And I just want to remind us that next Saturday, which will be June 26, 11 o'clock Eastern again, please don't miss Peter Hayes. Peter will be talking about action and reaction, a topic that is based on the book by the same spiritual author that of the one that you talked about here today with Evolution in Two Worlds. Andre Luis has written the that book, Action and Reaction, and Peter Hayes will be talking about it. But Paulo, as we come to this moment at the end of our lecture, and I'm sorry that we have to stop now, but I want to ask you to please say a prayer for us before we go.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
So let's all close our eyes, connect our minds, our thoughts, raise them, elevate them to the spiritual world, and thank our mentors, our personal mentors, the mentors of all that work that we're trying to do here in the United States through the US Federation, through the US Spiritist Medical Association, to bring a little bit of the spiritual word, the spiritual teachings to more people here on earth. It's with the heart full of gratitude that I came here today, that I met here with you today. And that's how I want to finish as well. I want to thank all of our mentors. I want to thank everyone who participated, who discussed, and I hope you all have a blessed weekend. So be it.
So be it. Thank you.
Bye bye.